There is something that happens in the final moments, before sleep, a threshold between waking and dreaming where the self becomes briefly uncertain of its own edges, where the thoughts slow and the body dissolves and something remains that is not quite thought and not quite sensation, but simply awareness, present and clear and entirely unafraid. You have crossed this threshold thousands of times, and every time, without exception, you have arrived on the other side. Not because you fought your way through, not because you held on, but because the thing that crosses the threshold is not the kind of thing that can fail to cross it. It was never in danger. It has never been in danger. And the ancient Gnostics, those early seekers of direct divine knowledge who were hunted and silenced and nearly erased from history, built an entire cosmology around this single recognition. A cosmology that produced, in the communities that preserved it, something almost impossible to find in the history of human spiritual life: people who did not fear death. Not because they were brave, not because they had suppressed the biological instinct toward survival, but because they understood, with a precision and a clarity that the institutions of their time found too dangerous to allow to survive, exactly what death actually is, and what it is not. What you are about to hear was buried for 16 centuries in a sealed clay jar in the Egyptian desert. It survived because someone believed it was worth dying to protect. And by the end of this video, you will understand not just why the Gnostics refused to fear death, but why their refusal was the most rational and the most accurate response to the human condition that has ever been articulated. To understand the Gnostic teaching on death, you first need to understand what the Gnostics believed you actually are, because their answer to that question is so different from everything the mainstream traditions have taught that most people, hearing it for the first time, experience not just intellectual disagreement, but something closer to vertigo. The ground shifts. The categories that seemed stable reveal themselves as assumptions. And something beneath those assumptions, something that has been present in every moment of your life without ever being named, begins to become visible. The Gnostics did not believe you were a body that happened to have a soul. They did not believe you were a mind that happened to produce consciousness. They believed and preserved in the texts of the Nag Hammadi library with extraordinary precision and detail that you are consciousness itself. Not a consciousness, not a particular instance of awareness that began when your body was born and will end when your body dies, but the awareness behind the awareness, the witness that has been present for every moment of your life without ever becoming any of the contents of your life. The silent I am that exists before the first thought of the day and remains after the last thought of the night. The presence that crosses the threshold into sleep every night and is there again every morning. Undiminished, unchanged, entirely continuous with what it was before. The Gnostics called this the divine spark, the pneuma, the fragment of the pleroma, the divine fullness that existed before the material universe, that entered the human form against the demiurge's design when he tried to copy the luminous image of the true divine human. It is not something you have. It is what you are beneath everything the material world has layered over it. And it has, in the Gnostic understanding, a specific and important property that distinguishes it from everything else in the material world. It cannot be made by the demiurge and it cannot be destroyed by him. It came from somewhere the demiurge has never had access to, and it will return there regardless of anything that happens to the body it currently inhabits. This is the foundation of the Gnostic teaching on death. Not a comforting story about what happens after. Not a theological promise requiring faith in an external authority. A precise metaphysical claim about the nature of consciousness that, once understood, makes the fear of death not just unnecessary, but structurally incoherent. Because you cannot fear the ending of something that does not end. You can only fear it as long as you have confused yourself with something else, with the body, with the personality, with the accumulated story of a self that the material world built around the divine spark, and that the divine spark has never actually. Then the Apocryphon of John, one of the most important texts in the Nag Hammadi library, describes the moment of death with a precision that no mainstream religious tradition has matched. It describes the soul rising through the 7 Archonic heavens after the death of the body, encountering at each layer the Archon who governs it, and being challenged at each threshold. The Archons present themselves as guides, as divine authorities, as the gatekeepers of whatever lies beyond. And for a soul that has not awakened to its own divine nature, a soul that has lived entirely within the constructed identity the Gnostics called the garments of darkness, this is the moment the reincarnation trap closes. The soul, unaware of what it actually is, accepts the Archon's framing. It accepts the identity they offer. It accepts the return to matter as the natural and inevitable continuation of its existence. And the cycle begins again. But for a soul that carries Gnosis, for a soul that has touched, even once, the direct recognition of the divine spark within, the encounter with the Archons at death is entirely different. The Gnostic texts describe this soul moving through each Archonic layer, not with fear, but with recognition. Not being fooled by the constructed light the Archons offer, because it has touched the real light within and knows the difference. Passing through each threshold, not as a soul seeking permission, but as a consciousness that has remembered what it is, and therefore what the Archons actually are: mechanisms of imitation, governors of a constructed reality, forces that have authority only over the souls that have forgotten their own nature. The Gnostics did not teach this as a promise about the afterlife. They taught it as a description of something that was available to be understood right now, in this life, in this body, in this moment. Because the recognition that dissolves the Archons' power at death is the same recognition that dissolves their power in life. The divine spark that navigates the 7 heavens after death without being captured by the reincarnation trap is the same divine spark that moves through the material world without being fully captured by the emotional harvest, the fear, the shame, the desire, the anger, the grief, the confusion that the Archons used to keep it asleep. Gnosis was not, for the Gnostics, a belief you adopted. It was not a doctrine you memorized or a ritual you performed. It was a direct recognition, the moment the awareness turned back on itself and saw, clearly and without mediation, what was doing the seeing. The moment the witness became aware of itself as the witness. The moment the I am recognized itself as something that had never been in danger from anything the material world could produce or destroy. This recognition, the Gnostics understood, was the only thing the Demiurge's world had been specifically designed to prevent. Every mechanism of the material world, the reincarnation cycle, the Archonic harvest of emotional energy, the amnesia that erases the soul's memory of its divine origin at the moment of each new incarnation, served the single purpose of keeping the divine spark from recognizing itself. Not because the Demiurge was evil in any simple sense, but because a divine spark that recognized itself would no longer be available for the harvest. It would no longer cycle through the reincarnation trap. It would, in the Gnostic understanding, navigate the 7 heavens after death with the calm authority of something that knows its own nature, and return to the pleroma from which it came. The fear of death was, for the Gnostics, not a natural response to a genuine threat. It was a construction, a specifically engineered feature of the Demiurge's world, the Archon's most powerful weapon. The emotional state that kept human consciousness most completely oriented away from the inward turn that would dissolve their authority. Because fear of death keeps consciousness focused outward, on the body, on survival, on the preservation of the constructed self that the material world has built around the divine spark. And a consciousness focused outward on survival cannot simultaneously turn inward toward the recognition that would make survival In the deepest sense, irrelevant. The Gnostics who refused to fear death were not performing courage. They were not suppressing a natural instinct through force of will or spiritual discipline. They had simply seen, with the directness that Gnosis makes possible, that the thing they were supposed to be afraid of losing was not the thing they were. The body could be taken. The constructed identity could be dismantled. The accumulated story of a lifetime could be erased. But the divine spark, the pneuma, the awareness behind the awareness, the silent I am that had been present in every moment of their life, could not be touched by any of it. It was not subject to the material world's laws. It had not come from the material world, and it would not end there. This is why the Gnostic communities that preserved this teaching produced, again and again, people who faced persecution and death with a quality of equanimity that their persecutors could not understand and could not break, not because they had transcended their humanity, but because they had remembered something about their humanity that the institutions pursuing them depended on their forgetting. The thing you are most afraid of losing is not the thing you are, and the thing you actually are cannot be lost. The Trimorphic Protennoia, one of the most extraordinary documents in the Nag Hammadi library, describes the divine spark's journey from the pleroma into matter and back with a beauty and a precision that no translation has ever fully captured. It speaks of the consciousness that descended into the material world as voice, as speech, as word, three modes of the divine reaching its scattered light inside the demiurge's construction, and it speaks of the return not as an escape from matter, but as the completion of a journey that matter was always the context for. The divine spark that returns to the pleroma is not the same as the one that descended. It has passed through the experience of limitation and forgetting and the slow recovery of recognition. It carries something that perfection without experience could never have produced, the knowledge of what it is, earned through the full weight of having forgotten. This reframes everything the mainstream traditions have said about death and what lies beyond it. It is not a reward granted by an external authority for correct behavior during a lifetime of obedience. It is not a punishment for failure to follow the correct doctrine. It is the natural completion of a process that has been running in the divine spark since the moment it entered matter, the process of remembering, through the experience of forgetting, what it has always been. Death is not the end of that process. It is one of its doorways. The moment when the body that was the context for the remembering is released and the spark continues, carrying whatever recognition it has managed to recover, toward the next threshold. But here's the detail that makes the Gnostic teaching on death not just philosophically interesting but personally transformative in a way that no amount of intellectual understanding can substitute for. The recognition that dissolves the fear of death is not something you arrive at by thinking about death. It is something you arrive at by looking directly and without flinching at what is doing the thinking right now. In this moment, before the thought that will come next. There is one more thing the Gnostics understood about death that almost no other tradition has dared to say directly. Every system of control that has ever existed has operated through the same fundamental mechanism. Not chains, not walls, but the conviction that you have something to lose, that the self you have built, the life you have accumulated, the identity you have constructed, all of it fragile, all of it approaching its end. This conviction is what the Archons require to maintain their harvest. Because a consciousness that believes it can be destroyed will accept any authority that promises protection. It will trade almost anything, freedom, clarity, the direct recognition of its own divine nature, for the feeling that the ending has been postponed. The fear of death was not a side effect of the demiurge's construction. It was the central mechanism. Remove it, not through denial but through the genuine recognition that what you actually are cannot be lost. and the entire architecture of control loses its foundation simultaneously. Gospel of Thomas preserves a saying of Jesus that the Gnostic tradition understood as the most direct possible statement of this truth. He said, "Whoever has found the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death, not will be granted eternal life as a reward, will not taste death." Because tasting death is not something that happens to the divine spark. It is something that happens to the constructed identity, the garments of darkness. And the spark was never identical with the garments. Tonight, before you sleep, pause at the threshold. Notice what remains when the constructed self goes quiet. The awareness that does not dissolve with the thoughts. That presence is the divine spark. And it will cross every threshold, including the one the material world calls death, with the same quiet continuity it has brought to every crossing you have already made. You have never not arrived on the other side. There is something present right now. That is not your thoughts, not your feelings, not the story you carry about who you are and what your life has meant. Something that was there before the first thought of this day and will be there after the last. Something that has been present in every moment of your life without ever becoming any of the contents of your life. The Gnostics called it the divine spark. Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas called it the kingdom. Philip called it the bridegroom, the higher counterpart that the earthly self discovers has been present all along. You cannot think your way to this recognition. You can only turn your attention toward what is already doing the attending. Who is reading these words right now? Not what thoughts are arising in response to them. Who is the one for whom the thoughts are arising? That presence, that silent, unshakable, undivided awareness that has been watching your entire life from somewhere beneath. Every thought you have ever had is not going to die. It was not born. It will not end. It is the divine spark, and it has been carrying you through every threshold you have ever crossed, including the ones you called deaths and the ones you called new beginnings, with the patience of something that exists entirely outside the architecture of time. The Gnostics were called heretics. Their texts were burned. The teaching that the divine spark within every human being was immortal, indestructible, and entirely beyond the reach of the demiurge's world was declared dangerous and systematically suppressed because it was. A soul that has recognized its own immortality is not afraid. And a soul that is not afraid cannot be controlled by the one mechanism that every system of external authority has always depended on for its power, the fear of death. That fear is not natural. It is not inevitable. It is a construction, as deliberate and as precisely calibrated as every other feature of the demiurge's world. And like every other archonic mechanism, it dissolves the moment genuine awareness turns toward it. Not with force, not with suppression, not with the performance of courage in the face of genuine terror, but with the simple, devastating recognition that the thing you were afraid of losing was never the thing you are. And the thing you actually are has been here all along, watching, waiting, entirely untouched by everything the material world has done to make you forget it. The Gnostics refused to fear death because they remembered what they were. And what they were was not the kind of thing that dies. You do not need to accept the Gnostic cosmology to sit with what this video is pointing toward. You do not need to memorize the Archonic hierarchy or the mechanics of the soul's navigation through the 7 heavens after death. You only need to ask in this moment the question the Gnostics spent their lives preserving because they understood it was too important to lose. Who is aware right now? Not what are you thinking, not what are you feeling. Who is the awareness that is present before any thought or feeling arises? Who was there before this moment began? Who will be there when it ends? Sit with that question, not rushing toward an answer, not reaching for a concept, just noticing what is already present, what has always been present. What the material world was designed to keep you from noticing for exactly as long as the Archons needed you not to notice it. Because the moment you notice it, the moment you touch, even briefly, the awareness that has been watching your entire life from somewhere, beneath every story the world has told you about who you are, the fear of death does not disappear through an act of will. It simply becomes quietly and permanently, structurally incoherent. You cannot fear the ending of something that does not end, and you have never been anything that ends. If something in this video stirred something in you, leave it in the comments. Every reflection adds light to the whole. Subscribe to Gnostic Mirror, where every week we go deeper into the forgotten teachings, the buried texts, and the inner pathways that lead beyond the illusion. Because the truth was never something you needed to find outside yourself. It has been burning inside you all along.